Let us begin in the stillness of the ancient land, where the desert winds carry the prayers of generations, and the starlit heavens look down on a people who yearn for something more. Israel, beloved of the Lord, had journeyed long and far to reach this moment in their story. They had seen the wonders of God with their own eyes, the Red Sea parting in majestic walls of water, the manna falling softly with the dawn, water springing forth from rock in the wilderness. They had crossed into the promised land by His command and seen the mighty walls of Jericho fall without a single strike of the sword. Yet even as they walked in the memory of such wonders, their hearts were restless, their trust often faltering like a candle in the wind. The days of the judges had left deep impressions on the heart of the nation. Leaders rose and fell. For a brief time, they would deliver Israel from the hand of their oppressors, but when the leader passed away, the people slipped back into the patterns of their own wandering. Each man did what was right in his own eyes. Unity felt like a fragile clay vessel, cracking under the strain of the times. They were surrounded by enemies pressing in, their fields raided, their borders threatened. In this uncertainty, fear whispered among the people, fear of tomorrow, fear that perhaps they had lost their way. So, their eyes turned outward. They saw the nations around them with their kings, men who rode at the head of armies, wearing crowns of gold, speaking with a single voice that commanded loyalty and strength. And their longing grew. "Give us a king," they cried. "Give us a king to lead us, that we might be like the other nations." It was a cry born not merely from envy but from weariness, a desire for security and belonging. Beneath this yearning, the deepest echo was the same as it had always been, the desire for a king who could shepherd them, not only in battle, but in heart and spirit. The prophets and priests knew the true king of Israel was the Lord Himself. It was He who had led them by the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. It was He who had fought their battles and held them close in covenant love. Yet, in their weariness, the people longed for something visible, a king of flesh and blood who could stand before them in their doubt and go before them in their fear. Imagine, if you will, the quiet nights of the hill country. Families gathered around small fires, their faces lined with the hardships of the day. They spoke in hushed tones of raiders, of harvests that failed, of neighboring tribes whose unity made them strong. They prayed for safety, for provision, for unity among the scattered tribes. And in the deepest corners of their hearts, they whispered the oldest prayer. "Lord, send us a leader who will not fail us, one who knows your heart and walks in your ways." The longing for a faithful king was not merely political. It was spiritual. It was the echo of Eden, when humanity walked in unbroken fellowship with their Creator. They yearned for leadership that could restore them to that nearness, a kingdom founded not on conquest or power, but on righteousness and truth. There remained, even in these restless days, a quiet thread of hope. In the Psalms of Levites, in the prayers of mothers and fathers, in the stories told by firelight, the ancient promise still lived. From the line of Abraham, through Isaac and Jacob, God had spoken of a blessing that would come to all nations. A ruler would one day arise, a shepherd who would lead His people in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of His name. Though the people could not yet see when or how this would come, their hearts yearned for it, like parched earth longing for the first rains of spring. Samuel, the prophet of the Lord, heard this longing and carried it in his own heart. He had anointed Saul, the man the people had demanded, tall, impressive, outwardly strong. And yet Saul's reign showed the truth. A king who does not walk with God cannot lead his people into true peace. As Saul's failures grew heavy upon the nation, the yearning for a different kind of king deepened, one who would not only defend their borders but guide their souls, one who would seek not his own glory but the heart of the Lord. Picture the nation under twilight. Across the hills, shepherds keep watch over scattered flocks. The wind carries the scent of the earth, cool and dry, under skies heavy with stars, stars that have witnessed generations of longing. Elders lift prayers for unity. Mothers pray for the safety of their children. Farmers pray for rain on fields that thirst. Beneath them all lies a deeper petition. Lord, lead us. Shepherd us back to you. Give us a king who knows your heart. It was in this collective longing that the story of David truly began. For even before the prophet's horn of oil would pour upon the head of Jesse's youngest son, God had already been preparing a shepherd after his own heart. The faithful king they desired was growing quietly, unseen, in the fields outside Bethlehem, learning to lead sheep, to sing psalms beneath the stars, to trust the unseen hand of God. And yet the people did not know. They only knew the ache of waiting. The longing for a faithful king weighed heavy on their spirits, as expectation gathers before the dawn. Perhaps we, too, know such longing, the yearning for leadership that does not falter, for guidance that does not fail, for a shepherd who knows us fully and leads us with integrity and compassion. Like Israel, our hearts whisper in the quiet, Lord, guide us. Lead us close to you. Even now, the God who had always been their true king was at work. He heard their prayers carried on the desert wind, and he was already weaving the next chapter of their story. Soon, they would see that true kingship is not found in outward stature or worldly power, but in a heart surrendered wholly to him. And so they waited, as the generations before them had waited, hearts heavy yet hopeful, their petitions rising to the God who had never left them. Above, the same stars that watched over Abraham and Jacob still shone in silent witness. And in the unseen quiet of Bethlehem's hills, the answer was being prepared, a shepherd boy whose heart beat in rhythm with the heart of God. In the days when the longing of Israel for a faithful king had grown deep, the Lord whispered his plans to his prophet. Samuel, the man who had served God since his own childhood, had grown old, and the weight of leading the people pressed heavily upon him. He had seen their cry for a king, had anointed Saul, and had watched as Saul, chosen for his stature and outward strength, drifted from the heart of the Lord. A shadow had fallen over the king's reign, the kind of shadow that comes when a man seeks his own way rather than the way of God. Samuel grieved over Saul, not because of lost power or politics, but because he loved the people of Israel. He carried their pain and their restlessness like a shepherd carries a wounded lamb. In the stillness of his prayer, the Lord spoke. How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king. It was an unexpected word. Bethlehem was a small town, a quiet place of rolling hills and scattered flocks. Not the seat of power, not a place from which one would expect a king to rise. Yet Samuel, obedient to the voice of the Lord, prepared himself for the journey. He walked the dusty road to Bethlehem with the horn of oil at his side, the very instrument that would mark God's chosen one. Fear flickered in his heart, for Saul still sat on the throne, and to anoint another was to move against the king. Yet above the tremor of fear, the prophet carried a deeper trust in the one who had led him all his days. When Samuel arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled at his coming. Do you come in peace? They asked, for a prophet's presence often carried the weight of divine judgment. Samuel nodded gently. In peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. Among those he invited was Jesse, a man of quiet faith with many sons. One by one, Jesse's sons were called before Samuel. The first, Eliab, stood tall and strong, with the bearing of a leader. Samuel's heart stirred as he looked upon him. Surely this is the Lord's anointed, he thought. But the voice of God whispered in reply, firm yet tender, Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One by one, the sons passed before Samuel, Abinadab, Shammah, and 4 others. Each carried his own strength, his own talents, but with each the Lord said, Not this one. Confusion flickered in Samuel's thoughts. Had he misunderstood? Turning to Jesse, he asked, "Are these all the sons you have?" Jesse hesitated. "There is still the youngest," he said, almost as an afterthought. "He is out tending the sheep." The prophet nodded. "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." And so a runner was sent into the hills. Somewhere in the quiet fields outside Bethlehem, a young shepherd named David kept watch over his father's flock. His life was simple, days filled with the bleating of sheep, the sun's warmth on his face, and the quiet songs of praise he lifted to the God he had come to know in the solitude of the pasture. He had faced lions and bears with a courage born of trust, not in his own strength, but in the hand of the Lord who guarded both him and his flock. When David arrived, dust clinging to his tunic, the prophet saw at once what the Lord had seen, not the outward strength that men admired, but a heart alive with faith and a quiet courage that came from walking closely with God. As David stepped into the circle of his family, the voice of the Lord spoke again, clear and sure. "Rise and anoint him, this is the one." Samuel uncorked the horn of oil, and in the presence of David's brothers, he poured the fragrant oil over the young shepherd's head. The oil ran down his hair and onto his shoulders, a visible sign of an invisible calling. And as it did, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day forward. In that sacred moment, heaven bore witness to the anointing of Israel's true king, not a king chosen by human standards, but by the searching gaze of God, who looks upon the heart. Yet David did not ascend to a throne that day. The anointing marked the beginning of a journey, one that would lead him through valleys of hardship, fields of victory, and caves of hiding. For now, he returned to his sheep, carrying within him the quiet weight of God's promise. Samuel departed Bethlehem with a heart both heavy and hopeful. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with trials, for Saul still reigned, and David's calling would not come to fruition overnight. But he also knew this: the God who chooses does not fail. The Lord who had sought a king after his own heart had found him. Imagine the scene as twilight falls upon Bethlehem. Jesse and his sons return to their home, still murmuring over what has just taken place. David, the youngest, returns to the hills, the scent of oil lingering on his skin, his harp slung across his back. He looks up at the stars, the same stars beneath which he had so often sung his psalms, and whispers his praise to the God who has chosen him. In the heavens, unseen by mortal eyes, the Lord delights in the one he has anointed. For the faithful king Israel longed for, the king after God's own heart, has been found, not in the palaces of the powerful, but in the humble heart of a shepherd boy. And so, in the quiet fields of Bethlehem, the story of David truly begins, a story of a heart chosen not for appearance or strength, but for its steadfast love of God, a story that would one day reveal the kind of kingship that mirrors the very heart of heaven. In the soft hush of Bethlehem's hills, life for David returned to its simple rhythms. Though the prophet's horn had poured oil upon his head and marked him for something far beyond his imagining, he did not yet sit upon a throne, nor did the crowds chant his name. Instead, each morning still found him rising with the sun, staff in hand, guiding his father's sheep to pastures scattered across the rugged Judean countryside. The anointing was a secret held in the quiet of his own heart, like a lamp flickering beneath a shelter, its light known only to him, his family, and the God who had chosen him. David's days were shaped by the steady pace of shepherding, a calling that was both humble and demanding. The sheep were not his own, yet he bore their safety as if they were a sacred trust. He led them to green pastures when the rains had been kind and searched tirelessly for grazing grounds when the earth turned dry and stubborn. He stood guard beneath the relentless sun, his eyes scanning for predators that prowled the hills, ready to strike at the unsuspecting. And when danger came, as it often did, David met it with a courage drawn not from himself, but from a deep-seated faith in the God who watched over both shepherd and flock. Lions and bears had tested him before, and each time the Lord had given him the strength to protect the helpless entrusted to his care. There, in the solitude of the fields, David came to know the voice of God with a nearness that city streets and crowded halls rarely allowed. The wind that swept over the hills carried whispers of the Creator's presence. The stars that burned like countless lamps above became silent witnesses to his prayers. Each bleating lamb, each soft rustle of the grass, seemed to join in a hymn that David alone could hear. And so his harp became his constant companion. Its strings, worn by hours of playing, spoke of the heart of a young man who sang not for applause but for the joy of worship itself. David's songs were not composed in haste or for the ears of men. They were born in the stillness, where his thoughts rose unfiltered to heaven. He sang of the beauty he saw in creation, the rolling hills kissed by morning light, the streams that cut through the valleys like threads of silver, the strength of the mountains standing steadfast beneath the sky. He sang of trust in the God who provided for his flock as surely as he provided for his own soul. He sang of fear turned to courage, of loneliness transformed into companionship by the presence of the Almighty. These were not mere songs, they were psalms, the earliest expressions of a heart learning to pour itself out in unguarded honesty before its Maker. At night, when the flock was gathered safely into the fold, David would lie beneath the vast canopy of stars, his head resting upon a smooth stone, his harp cradled against his chest. He would gaze upward at the countless constellations, each one a silent declaration of the God who had set them in their places, and wonder at the mystery of being known and chosen by that same God. "What is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him?" he might whisper, his voice barely rising above the night breeze. Yet even in his wonder, a quiet assurance would settle over him, the one who had called him would not forsake him. In these long, unhurried hours, David's heart was being shaped for the kingship that lay ahead. Shepherding taught him patience, the kind that comes from walking slowly with creatures that cannot be hurried. It taught him vigilance, for danger often came without warning, demanding both quickness of thought and steadiness of hand. It taught him tenderness, for a good shepherd must know his flock, must recognize the weary and the wounded, and must lead even the most stubborn with gentleness rather than force. These lessons, learned far from the eyes of men, would one day define his reign as a king after God's own heart. There were lonely days, to be sure, when the silence pressed heavy upon him and the ache for companionship stirred in his chest. Yet even in solitude, David found a friend in the Lord. He discovered that in the quiet spaces where human voices could not reach, the voice of God spoke most clearly. And so he began to see his work not as obscurity but as preparation, a sacred trust in which every moment was an opportunity to walk more closely with the one who had chosen him. Sometimes, as he played his harp and sang beneath the stars, thoughts of the prophet's anointing would return to him. He would remember the weight of Samuel's gaze, the oil warm as it flowed over his head, and the certainty that the Spirit of the Lord had come upon him that day. And yet, in those moments, the future seemed distant and shrouded in mystery. He did not yet know what trials and triumphs awaited him, only that the God who had called him was faithful. It was enough. As seasons passed, the hills and valleys of Bethlehem became like an extension of David's own soul. He knew every rise and hollow, every hidden spring where the sheep might drink. He knew the scent of the wild thyme that grew in the crevices of the rocks, and the sound of the wind as it whispered through the olive groves. These were the landscapes that framed his prayers, the silent witnesses to a growing intimacy with God. Often his psalms carried echoes of the shepherd's life. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Perhaps those words were first whispered in these very fields, shaped by the lived reality of guiding, guarding, and providing for his flock. In caring for the sheep, David had come to understand something of the Lord's own care for his people, a care marked not by distant oversight but by intimate, attentive presence. The nights were not always peaceful. There were storms that swept suddenly over the hills, rain pelting against his cloak as he sought shelter for the flock. There were nights when the cry of a predator split the darkness, and David rose with sling in hand, his heart steady in the knowledge that the Lord who had delivered him before would deliver him again. Each trial deepened his reliance upon God, weaving courage and faith into the very fabric of his being. Through it all, David remained largely unseen by the world, yet deeply seen by God. The throne that awaited him was still far off, and the recognition of men had not yet come. But in the fields, beneath the unchanging heavens, the Lord was shaping a king, not in the courts of power, but in the quiet faithfulness of a shepherd's life. And David, unaware of how fully his life would one day change, continued to live each day with a heart open to the presence of God. Imagine him one evening, sitting upon a rocky outcrop as the last light of day fades from the horizon. The sheep, now settled, graze in soft contentment. David strums a gentle melody upon his harp, his voice low and steady, a song of gratitude rising to the one who holds all things. The stars begin to emerge, pricking the velvet sky with their light, and a deep peace settles over the hills. In that moment, David is simply a shepherd boy, yet in the unseen realm, the king of Israel is being formed, a king whose heart, already anchored in worship, will one day lead a nation back to the heart of God. And so the days pass, each one a thread in the tapestry of David's becoming. In the hidden places where few take notice, the Lord is at work, shaping a shepherd into a king, a psalmist into a warrior, and a young man into a vessel for his purposes. Under the stars of Bethlehem, the story of David continues to unfold, written not with ink upon parchment, but with the quiet obedience of a heart fully surrendered to its maker. From the earliest days of his youth, David's life bore a quiet thread that distinguished him from many of those around him, a heart that beat in rhythm with the heart of God. He was not born into greatness as the world measures it, nor raised in the courts of kings, but in the humble hillsides of Bethlehem, where the flock under his care knew his voice long before any army or nation would. Even in obscurity, even when unseen by men, David learned what it meant to live in the presence of the Lord, to walk by faith when the path ahead was not yet visible, and to trust the unseen hand that guided his steps. Humility for David was not merely the absence of pride, it was the quiet recognition of who he was before God. He knew himself to be a shepherd, the youngest son in a family where his brothers held the positions of strength and honor. When the prophet Samuel came seeking the one whom the Lord had chosen, David had not even been considered worthy of invitation to the gathering. Yet even this did not embitter him. While his brothers stood before the prophet, David remained with his sheep, faithfully fulfilling the task that had been given to him. In this, we see the seed of a heart that served without demanding recognition, a heart that understood that the true measure of a man is not found in the applause of others but in the quiet approval of God. Faith, too, took root in these hidden years. Night after night, under the vast expanse of heaven, David came to know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob not merely as the God of his fathers, but as his own. When danger approached, when a lion or a bear threatened his flock, David did not rely on his own strength alone. He moved with the confidence of one who had learned that deliverance comes from the Lord. Each rescue, each narrow escape, became a testimony that deepened his trust. These encounters were not grand in the eyes of men, yet they prepared David for the day when he would face giants, not with fear, but with unshakable assurance that the battle belongs to the Lord. Trust in the unseen became the very air David breathed. As a shepherd, he knew what it was to lead sheep through valleys where the path ahead disappeared into shadows, trusting that the terrain would open to green pastures beyond. So too did he learn to trust the Lord's leading in his own life. He could not yet see the throne for which he had been anointed, nor did he seek to hasten its coming. Instead, he surrendered each day to the God who had promised, believing that the one who had called him would, in his own time, fulfill all that he had spoken. This willingness to wait, to walk faithfully in the meantime, became one of David's most defining qualities. The Psalms David composed in these years revealed the landscape of his inner life, a heart unafraid to pour itself out before God in both joy and despair, in confidence and in questioning. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Such words were not born from a life untouched by struggle, but from a faith refined in the solitude of the hills, where David learned that the presence of God was his truest refuge. Humility kept him low before the Almighty. Faith taught him to rise when fear pressed in. Trust anchored him when the way forward was hidden. Even in moments when doubt crept in, as it does for every heart, David turned not away, but toward the Lord. He brought his fears into the light of prayer, laying them down like burdens at the feet of the one who had carried him thus far. In this, he discovered that the God who shapes kings is also the God who shepherds souls, patient with their questions and faithful to their cries for help. David's strength was not in his flawless resolve, but in his willingness to return, again and again, to the wellspring of divine grace. It is a striking truth that the same qualities that made David a faithful shepherd, his attentiveness, his courage, his tenderness, were the very qualities that would one day make him a faithful king. The pasture became his training ground, not only for leadership but for the deeper work of cultivating a heart that could hold the weight of God's calling. Each lamb rescued from danger, each night spent in vigilant watch, etched into David's soul the understanding that authority is, at its core, an act of service. Consider for a moment the contrast between David's unseen preparation and the visible trappings of worldly power. In the courts of kings, ambition often jostles for position, and strength is measured by the breadth of armies and the height of walls. Yet in the quiet of the fields, David learned that true strength flows from dependence upon God, and true greatness is marked by the willingness to lead with a servant's heart. It was here, away from the noise and the acclaim, that David's identity was forged, not as the son overlooked by men, but as the one deeply known and chosen by the Lord. Humility, faith, and trust became the pillars of David's life, not because he was without fault, but because his heart was inclined toward God. Even in failure, as his story would later reveal, David's instinct was to return, to repent, to seek again the face of the one he loved. This is what it means to be a man after God's own heart, not perfection, but a posture of continual turning toward the one who is perfect. We may pause here and let this truth settle into our own hearts. How often do we find ourselves longing for recognition, measuring our worth by what others can see? Yet the story of David reminds us that the most significant shaping of our lives often happens in hidden places, where no one applauds, and the only audience is the God who delights in us. It is in these spaces, unseen, uncelebrated, that humility is nurtured, faith is tested, and trust in the unseen is woven deep into the fabric of our being. Imagine David again beneath the stars, his harp resting across his knees, his fingers drawing from its strings a melody known only to him and to God. The words that rise from his lips are a mixture of gratitude and longing, shaped by the awareness that every good thing flows from the hand of the Lord. He does not yet know what lies ahead, nor does he need to. For in this moment, the heart of the shepherd is at rest, fully confident in the care of the one who guides him. As we reflect on these lessons, we are reminded that the way of God often begins in the hidden places, where humility grows, faith takes root, and trust in the unseen becomes second nature. It is here, in the quiet surrender of the heart, that we learn to walk with God, not striving, not grasping, but resting in the assurance that His plans are good and His timing perfect. David's story, even in these early chapters, calls to us across the centuries to embrace humility, to cultivate faith, and to place our trust not in what we can see, but in the faithful God who holds all things. And as we do, we, like David, find ourselves being shaped, not for the applause of men, but for the purposes of the kingdom, where the greatest honor is simply to know and be known by the Lord. The sun dipped low over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across the valleys where shepherds tended their flocks and farmers brought in the last of their day's harvest. Yet beneath the soft hum of ordinary life, a tremor of unease rippled through the land. Whispers of danger traveled from village to village, carried by traders and travelers who had seen the movement of armies on the western plains. The Philistines, fierce and relentless, were gathering strength once again. Their presence had long been a thorn in Israel's side, a shadow that loomed large over the hearts of the people. The Philistines were no ordinary enemy. They were skilled in the art of war, their weapons forged from iron that gleamed darkly beneath the sun, stronger and sharper than the bronze blades Israel carried. From their cities along the coastal plain, they had pressed inland, challenging Israel's fragile unity and threatening its borders. Each encounter left behind stories of fear, villages raided, fields trampled, and warriors fallen. Families whispered prayers over their children at night, wondering if the next dawn would bring peace or the sound of approaching footsteps. Israel's army stood, but it stood divided. The tribes, each with their own leaders and concerns, struggled to act as one. Saul, the king whom the people had once hailed with hope, seemed diminished by doubt, his early zeal dampened by the weight of constant conflict. Rumors spread that the Spirit of the Lord, once vibrant upon him, had withdrawn, leaving a man troubled and uncertain. To many, it felt as though the strength of the nation had waned, like a candle flickering in the wind. On the other side, the Philistines thrived in their confidence. Their warriors, trained from youth, marched with discipline and carried weapons few in Israel could match. They were a people accustomed to conquest, pressing their advantage against those they saw as weaker. Their champions, towering men whose very presence struck fear, seemed invincible. And now, they were on the move again, their banners rising against the horizon like dark clouds signaling an approaching storm. In the villages nestled among Israel's hills, the tension was palpable. Conversations hushed when the threat was mentioned. Fathers sharpened their spears and checked the edges of their shields, while mothers gathered their children close, whispering words of comfort they themselves struggled to believe. As the Philistines advanced, they gathered in the valley of Elah, a broad expanse that stretched between the rising hills of Judah and the fortified cities of their own territory. It was a place chosen for war, where armies could array themselves in full strength. On one hill stood the Philistine encampment, their fires burning brightly through the night, the clang of metal and the sound of shouted commands filling the air. On the opposite ridge gathered the armies of Israel, their numbers smaller, their weapons less fearsome, their hearts heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Among the ranks of Israel's warriors, unease spread like an unspoken contagion. They had faced the Philistines before, and too often the encounters had ended in defeat. Each man knew that when the sun rose, he would stand opposite a force that had humbled Israel time and again. In the dark, as the campfires burned low, many turned their eyes toward the heavens, whispering prayers to the God of their fathers, the same God who had once parted seas and leveled mighty walls. Would he deliver them again? The tension of that moment was more than the fear of battle. It was the weight of an old and unhealed wound. Israel's struggle with the Philistines had lasted for generations, a recurring cycle of oppression and deliverance. With every fresh invasion came the reminder that they were a people still learning to trust the God who had called them his own. The Philistines, with their chariots and champions, embodied everything that seemed overwhelming and unconquerable, a living testament to the gap between human strength and divine power. In the stillness of the night, a shepherd boy tended his flock far from the gathering armies, unaware of the tension mounting in the valley below. Under the same starlit sky, he played his harp, the music mingling with his whispered songs of praise. He knew little of the fear gripping Israel's warriors or the menace of the Philistines encamped nearby. Yet in the unseen weaving of God's plans, that shepherd's quiet faith was already rising as the answer to Israel's trembling prayers. As dawn approached, the first rays of sunlight revealed the stark reality of the confrontation. Two armies faced one another, divided by the valley, the silence heavy with anticipation. And then, from the ranks of the Philistines, a figure emerged, a giant of a man, towering above all others, his armor gleaming like the scales of a beast. His voice boomed across the valley, taunting Israel, mocking their God, and challenging any who dared to stand against him. His name was Goliath, and with every word he spoke, fear took deeper root in the hearts of Israel's soldiers. Day after day, Goliath repeated his challenge, and day after day, no one in Israel's army dared to answer. Each morning, the people of God awoke to the echo of his scorn, their courage withering beneath the relentless assault. Even Saul, once hailed as the mightiest among them, stood silent, his heart weighed down by fear. In the homes of Israel, news of the standoff spread quickly. Families prayed for their sons on the battlefield, and the longing for deliverance grew more desperate. The nation, once so confident in its calling, seemed paralyzed, waiting for someone, anyone, who would rise to meet the challenge. And yet, even as fear gripped the hearts of men, the eyes of the Lord were upon a shepherd boy, guiding him toward the valley where the fate of Israel would be decided. For in the looming shadow of the Philistine threat, God was preparing to reveal a truth that would echo through the ages. The battle is never won by the strength of the arm or the sharpness of the sword, but by the power of the living God who fights for his people. David's courage was not the kind that springs from the pride of men or the boasting of warriors who trust in the sharpness of their swords. His was a quiet and steady courage, born not from himself, but from a life lived in the faithful presence of the Lord. Long before he stood in any valley facing giants, David had walked the rolling hills of Bethlehem as a shepherd, his days marked by the rhythm of tending sheep and lifting songs of praise beneath the endless sky. In the solitude of the fields, he learned the secret of true strength, that it is not found in the arm of flesh, but in the unwavering hand of God. Each day the wilderness schooled him in trust. Each night beneath the stars, his heart found its anchor in the one who neither slumbers nor sleeps. There had been moments in those lonely pastures when danger came unannounced. A lion once emerged from the shadows, its eyes glinting with the hunger of the wild. Another time, a bear charged from the brush, its roar splitting the still air. Yet David, small and seemingly defenseless, had not faltered. He pursued them, striking them down, rescuing the lambs from their jaws. He had known fear, yes, but even greater had he known the presence of the Lord who strengthened his hands and steadied his heart. Each victory deepened his certainty. The God who delivered him then would deliver him still. It was this quiet, deep-rooted trust that David carried with him when the day came that his path led beyond the familiar hills to the camp of Israel's army. He had not gone there seeking battle or glory. He came at his father's request, bringing bread and grain to his brothers. Yet what he found there shook him. The men of Israel, soldiers hardened by training and led by King Saul himself, were paralyzed by fear. Across the valley stood the Philistine champion, Goliath of Gath, a giant of a man, his stature towering over all others, his armor gleaming like a wall of bronze. For 40 days he had taunted the armies of the living God, his voice echoing across the valley like a challenge no one dared answer. To David, the fear that held the army captive was more startling than the giant's size. He heard in Goliath's words not just an insult to Israel's army, but a defiance against the Lord himself. And within David rose a holy indignation, not rooted in pride or recklessness, but in the unshakable conviction that the battle belonged to God. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" he asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Those words, spoken in the confidence of faith, were dismissed by the fearful as naivety. Even his own brothers rebuked him, mistaking his zeal for arrogance. But David's courage was of a different kind, the kind that refuses to measure the impossible by human sight, because it sees instead the limitless power of God. When David offered to fight Goliath, Saul tried to clothe him in the king's own armor, heavy plates of bronze, a sword fit for a warrior. Yet as David moved beneath the weight, he knew this was not his way. "I cannot go in these," he said, and removed them. He would not trust in the tools of men. Instead, he took in hand what was familiar, his shepherd's staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the brook. To those watching, he seemed almost foolish, a boy walking toward certain defeat. Yet David's heart was fixed not on appearances but on the faithfulness of God. He remembered the fields and the nights when the Lord had proven himself faithful. He remembered the times when the bleating of lambs had been replaced by the roar of predators, and yet he had been delivered. That same God, he knew, had not changed. David walked into the valley not with bravado, but with the deep assurance that the one who had been with him in the past would not abandon him now. We might pause here and let our hearts rest on this truth. Real courage is never the absence of fear, but the presence of trust. David was not fearless because he was strong. He was fearless because he knew who his God was. His faith was not an abstract belief but a living confidence, forged in the quiet obedience of many ordinary days spent seeking the Lord. As David approached the Philistine, Goliath mocked him, scoffing at the sight of a young shepherd boy with no sword or spear. Yet David's reply revealed the source of his courage. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." These words were not born from pride. They were a declaration of trust. David's confidence rested not on his skill with a sling nor on the smoothness of the stones he carried, but on the unchanging faithfulness of God. He knew that victory would not come by his hand but by the power of the Lord, and that through it all, God's name would be glorified. Even now, as we recall this moment, we may feel in our own hearts a flicker of that same courage, the kind that comes when we shift our gaze from the size of the giants before us to the greatness of the God who stands with us. David teaches us that courage does not require grand gestures or worldly strength. It is simply the willingness to trust, to step forward in obedience, even when the odds seem insurmountable. And so, in that valley where fear had held an entire army captive, one young shepherd stood firm, his heart steady in the knowledge that the battle belonged to the Lord. It was not David's size or skill that would turn the tide, but his unwavering trust in the one who had never failed him. The valley lay silent in that moment before the clash, the kind of stillness that carries the weight of 1,000 held breaths. On one slope, the army of Israel stood frozen, their shields catching the morning light but their courage faltering. On the other, the Philistine host waited in anticipation, their champion stepping forward with a mocking smile. Between them, in the expanse of open ground, walked a single figure, a shepherd boy with no armor, no sword, only a sling and the quiet certainty that the Lord who had always been faithful would not fail him now. Goliath, the giant of Gath, towered above men like a living fortress. His helmet and coat of bronze glinted, his spear like a weaver's beam, its iron point alone heavier than a man could easily lift. He looked at David and saw not a warrior, but a boy, ruddy-cheeked, untested, carrying nothing but a staff and a pouch of stones. Contempt twisted his voice as he thundered, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." But David did not falter. His heart, steady in the presence of the Lord, spoke words that carried across the valley like a clear trumpet call. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down, that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." The air itself seemed to tremble as David ran forward, his feet sure and unhesitating. He reached into his pouch and drew out a single stone, placing it in the sling he had wielded countless times under the quiet sky of Bethlehem. With a practiced motion, he whirled it above his head, the leather cord singing in the wind, and released. The stone flew straight and true, guided not by chance but by the unseen hand of the Almighty. It struck the giant squarely in the forehead, sinking deep, and the mighty Goliath toppled forward, his armored frame crashing to the earth with a sound that echoed like thunder. In that instant, the valley was filled with the stunned silence. The Philistine champion, who had terrorized Israel for 40 days, lay fallen, not by the sword of a warrior, but by a single smooth stone wielded in faith. David stood over the fallen giant, his chest rising and falling with the exertion of the moment, yet his heart remained steady, anchored in the certainty that the battle had always belonged to the Lord. Taking Goliath's own sword, he completed the victory, and the Philistine ranks wavered in shock and fear. Shouts rose from the Israelite lines as the soldiers, freed from their terror, surged forward. The Philistines fled, their confidence shattered, pursued by the very army they had once mocked. In the aftermath, the valley that had been a place of fear became a place of triumph. Israel's camp rang with the cries of victory, yet for David, the moment was marked not by pride but by awe. He knew this victory was not his own. It was the Lord's deliverance, the same faithfulness he had known when lions and bears threatened his flock. The smooth stone in his hand had become the instrument of a far greater power, the living God who saves not with sword or spear, but with his own mighty hand. For the people of Israel, the fall of Goliath was more than the defeat of a giant. It was the breaking of fear's hold over their hearts. They saw in David not merely a brave youth, but a vessel through whom God had shown his strength. And for David, the victory was a quiet affirmation of what he had always known in the solitude of the pasture, that when the Lord fights for his people, no enemy, no matter how great, can stand. As evening settled over the valley, David lifted his eyes to the heavens, the same heavens under which he had sung his psalms, and whispered his gratitude to the God who delivers. Somewhere deep within, he understood that this was only the beginning, the first step on a path that would one day lead him to a throne. Yet for now, he remained the same shepherd who had once watched the stars in wonder, his heart steadfastly trusting in the one who had brought down the giant. The valley of Elah still carried the echoes of the day's battle, the dust of fleeing armies settling like a memory on the wind. In the aftermath of Goliath's fall, Israel's soldiers, who had once stood paralyzed by fear, surged forward with a renewed courage that only victory can bring. Their voices rose in cries of triumph, their feet pounding the ground in pursuit of the Philistines, who scattered like chaff before the wind. Where moments earlier despair had hung heavy over the camp, hope now flowed like a fresh spring in the wilderness. David stood apart from the rush, his breathing steady, his sling at his side, the giant's own sword still heavy in his hand. Around him, men who had moments ago dismissed him as a boy now looked with wonder, some with awe, some still struggling to understand what they had witnessed. Yet in David's heart there was no boast, no swelling pride, only the quiet certainty that the Lord, who had delivered him from the paw of the lion and the bear, had once again shown himself faithful. The victory was not David's alone, it belonged to the God of Israel, who saves not by sword or spear, but by his own mighty power. Saul's messengers soon brought David before the king. The giant's severed head, a grim trophy of triumph, bore silent witness to what had taken place. Saul looked at the youth, still ruddy, still without armor, still with the simple bearing of a shepherd, and asked, almost incredulously, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered with the humility that marked his heart, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." In that moment, the name of David began to spread, carried on the lips of soldiers who had seen the impossible made real. Israel returned from the pursuit with the spoils of the vanquished, yet it was David's name that was whispered around the campfires that night. Many spoke of his courage, others of the uncanny precision of his sling, but those who had seen the look in his eyes knew there was something deeper, a faith that burned steady even in the face of the giant. In David they glimpsed the kind of leadership they had longed for, not the towering stature of Saul, but a heart wholly anchored in the Lord. Jonathan, the king's own son, watched David with a heart stirred in ways he could not yet name. He saw in the shepherd boy a kindred spirit, a trust in God that resonated deeply with his own. A bond began to form between them, one that would soon grow into a covenant stronger than blood, a friendship forged in faith and sealed by loyalty. As Israel celebrated, word of David's victory spread beyond the camp, reaching the towns and villages of the land. Mothers told their children of the boy who faced the giant with nothing but a sling and the name of the Lord. Farmers in their fields and shepherds on distant hills repeated the story, their voices laced with awe and hope. For in David's triumph, they saw more than the defeat of a Philistine warrior. They saw the hand of God at work, raising up a deliverer for his people. Yet with the rising fame came the first shadows of the path ahead. Saul watched David with an eye that shifted from admiration to unease. The cheers that once belonged to the king now turned toward the shepherd boy, and in Saul's heart, seeds of jealousy began to take root. But David remained unaware, his heart still fixed on the Lord, his steps still guided by the same trust that had led him from the quiet hills of Bethlehem to the battlefield of giants. In the days that followed, David was brought into Saul's service, no longer the nameless shepherd but now a commander among men. Wherever the king sent him, David prospered, for the Lord was with him. The people loved him, their confidence in this young warrior growing with each passing day. Yet for David, the truest measure of the victory remained not the acclaim of men, but the faithfulness of the God who had called him. As the sun set over the land, David found a quiet place away from the noise of celebration. He looked out over the hills, the same hills where he had once led his sheep, and lifted his voice in a song of gratitude. In the stillness of that evening, he understood that the same God who had given him victory over the lion, the bear, and the giant would guide him through whatever lay ahead. This triumph was not the culmination of his journey. It was the first step on a path that would lead him, through trials and triumphs alike, toward the destiny God had prepared for him. The halls of Saul's palace were vast, filled with the echoes of footsteps, the murmurs of servants, and the muted clang of armor. Yet amid all this grandeur, a heaviness lingered in the air. Saul, once chosen by God to lead Israel, now carried within him a growing shadow, an unrest that no crown or throne could silence. The Spirit of the Lord, which had once given him strength and clarity, had departed, leaving a hollow place where fear and torment crept in like an unending storm. On certain days, this inner darkness pressed so heavily upon him that even the sunlight streaming through the high windows seemed dim. Those who served him watched in unease as the king, restless and agitated, paced the length of his chambers, his mind consumed by thoughts no one could soothe. His counselors whispered among themselves, knowing that the king's condition required something beyond their wisdom. And so it was that a servant, recalling the skill of a young shepherd from Bethlehem, suggested music, not just any music, but the kind that seemed to carry with it the breath of heaven. David was summoned to the royal court, his harp slung across his shoulder, his fingers calloused not only from strings but from the rough work of shepherding. He entered quietly, his bearing unassuming, his gaze steady yet humble. Before him stood the King of Israel, a man towering in stature yet weighed down by an invisible burden. With a nod from the attendants, David sat and began to play. The notes that flowed from his harp were like streams of living water, clear and gentle, filling the room with a presence that was more than mere melody. Each plucked string seemed to carry the echoes of the pastures where David had first learned to worship, the wide open spaces where he had lifted his songs to the God of his fathers under the watchful gaze of the stars. As the music filled the air, Saul's rigid shoulders loosened, his restless pacing slowed, and the haunted look in his eyes began to soften. In those moments, the darkness that tormented Saul receded, like mist before the rising sun. The music did not erase his troubles, but it brought a measure of peace, a reminder of the presence of the Lord who still watched over Israel. For David did not simply play notes. He played from a heart attuned to God, each chord a prayer, each melody a thread of trust woven into the fabric of sound. Saul found himself drawn to the young musician, asking for his presence whenever the shadows pressed in too deeply. And so David remained, moving between the quiet hills of Bethlehem and the bustling courts of Gibeah, carrying his harp wherever he went. To the courtiers and guards, he was simply the shepherd boy whose music soothed the king. Yet in the unseen realm, something far greater was unfolding. The Spirit of the Lord, which had come upon David when Samuel anointed him, now worked through his music to bring light into the darkened heart of Israel's king. There were nights when Saul, lying restless upon his bed, would call for David, and the gentle strains of the harp would fill the room until sleep finally claimed him. At other times, David played as the king sat silently on his throne, lost in thought, the weight of leadership momentarily lifted by the melodies that spoke of a simpler trust, the kind David himself knew from his days tending sheep, where every note was an offering of praise. Though David's role seemed small, a mere musician in the king's service, it was in these quiet moments that the Lord was shaping him for greater things. Through the patience of service and the ministry of music, David learned that power does not always lie in swords and crowns, but in the unseen movements of a heart yielded to God. Even in the shadow of Saul's throne, David's faith deepened, his trust in the Lord growing as he witnessed firsthand the torment of a man who had turned away from the source of true peace. And so, in the court of the troubled king, David's heart became a vessel of God's presence, a balm for a weary soul, and a foreshadowing of the shepherd king he was destined to become. Jonathan, son of Saul, stood at his father's side as David's music filled the hall, and something stirred deep within him, a quiet recognition, as if his spirit had found a kindred one. Jonathan was a warrior, brave and capable, the heir to Saul's throne, yet he saw in David a quality that could not be measured by lineage or strength of arm. It was the presence of the Lord, the same presence that had once burned bright in Saul but now seemed to flicker like a candle in a draught. After David's victory over Goliath, Jonathan sought him out, not as a prince greeting a subject, but as one friend meeting another. Their words were few, but in that first conversation a covenant was born, a bond not of convenience or politics, but of mutual trust and a shared devotion to God. Jonathan loved David as he loved his own soul, and he saw in him not a rival to be feared, but a brother given by the Lord. In a gesture both symbolic and deeply personal, Jonathan removed his royal robe and placed it upon David. He gave him his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt, the very emblems of his status as the king's son. In this act, Jonathan declared with quiet certainty what few could yet see, that David was God's chosen one, and that he, Jonathan, would stand by him. It was a covenant of loyalty and sacrifice, sealed not by oaths before men but by the sincerity of their hearts before God. As the days turned into weeks, their friendship deepened, a rare and precious bond in a world where ambition and fear often severed even the strongest ties. Jonathan defended David when Saul's jealousy began to grow, speaking well of him to the king. "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has brought you great benefit." He pleaded with his father, reminding him that David's victories were the Lord's victories, that to strike at David was to fight against the hand of God himself. There were moments when Jonathan risked his own life to protect David, secretly warning him of Saul's plots and helping him to escape when danger drew near. On more than one occasion, they met in the wilderness, speaking in hushed tones, their words heavy with the knowledge that the path ahead would not be easy. Yet each parting was marked by the same steadfast promise. "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord." For David, hunted and pursued, Jonathan's friendship was like water in a parched land, a source of strength and encouragement in the face of mounting trials. And for Jonathan, whose loyalty to his father could not eclipse his allegiance to the will of God, this friendship became a living testimony to his own integrity. Their covenant endured, a thread of light woven through the darkness of Saul's increasingly troubled reign. It was a reminder that even in times of fear and uncertainty, the Lord provides relationships that reflect His own steadfast love, friendships that lift us up when the weight of the world presses down, that remind us of who we are when the voices around us seek to define us otherwise. There were moments when Jonathan risked his own life to protect David, secretly warning him of Saul's plots and helping him to escape when danger drew near. On more than one occasion, they met in the wilderness, speaking in hushed tones, their words heavy with the knowledge that the path ahead would not be easy. Yet each parting was marked by the same steadfast promise. Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord. For David, hunted and pursued, Jonathan's friendship was like water in a parched land, a source of strength and encouragement in the face of mounting trials. And for Jonathan, whose loyalty to his father could not eclipse his allegiance to the will of God, this friendship became a living testimony to his own integrity. The shadow that had begun as a whisper in Saul's heart slowly deepened into a storm that consumed his thoughts. At first, it had been a fleeting unease, a restlessness stirred by the songs of the women of Israel. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. The words, meant as a celebration of victory, pierced Saul like an arrow. The once beloved shepherd boy, whose music had soothed his troubled spirit, now stood before him as a rival in the eyes of the people. Saul's gaze, once filled with gratitude for David's service, hardened with suspicion. The Spirit of the Lord that had once empowered him had departed, leaving behind a hollow ache, a gnawing fear that the throne would slip through his grasp. Each time David entered his presence, Saul felt the invisible weight of divine favor resting upon the young man. He could not name it, but he knew the Lord was with David, and the glory that had once been his was shifting away. What began as silent envy soon found voice in words laced with bitterness, and then in actions born of rage. Twice, in moments when the torment of his own spirit overwhelmed him, Saul hurled his spear at David as he played the harp. The weapon thudded into the wall where David's body had been only a heartbeat before. Yet David did not retaliate. He evaded the attacks with the same quiet grace that marked his life, refusing to lift his hand against the king he still served. As David's fame grew among the people, through victories on the battlefield and the undeniable evidence of God's favor, Saul's fear deepened. He plotted in secret, weaving schemes to place David in danger, hoping that the Philistines would accomplish what his own hand could not. But each time, David returned victorious, his renown only increasing, and with it, Saul's dread. Jonathan, ever loyal to David, became a voice of reason and a shield of protection, speaking to his father in defense of his friend, reminding Saul of David's faithfulness. Yet Saul's jealousy had taken root too deeply. Moments of clarity would come, brief flickers when he would swear by the Lord that David's life was safe, but the promises faded like mist under the morning sun. David's life became a fugitive's, marked by constant movement and narrow escapes. In the stillness of night, when sleep eluded him, he poured out his heart in psalms that carried both the ache of betrayal and the unshaken confidence in God's protection. You are my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust. Through every pursuit, every trap laid in secret, the Lord's hand preserved David. Saul's jealousy, though fierce, could not overcome the will of God. In the quiet moments between the hunts, Saul himself seemed to know this truth, for there were times when, overcome by the evidence of David's righteousness, he wept aloud and confessed, "You are more righteous than I. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly." And yet the cycle continued, fear, anger, pursuit, until jealousy became the lens through which Saul saw the world. His heart, once chosen by God, had become a battlefield of its own, and in his obsession to hold the throne, he lost the very peace and favor he sought to keep. Envy, like a creeping shadow, can darken even the brightest heart, and Saul's story became the living portrait of that truth. It began as a spark, a passing thought, a comparison made in the wake of triumph, but soon the spark became a flame that consumed his joy, his reason, and even his sense of who he was before God. As the days turned into months, Saul's gaze fixed ever tighter upon David, the shepherd boy turned warrior, the one who carried the undeniable favor of the Lord. But woven into Saul's unraveling was a different thread, the unyielding loyalty of David and Jonathan, a loyalty born not of ambition or fear, but of covenant love. Jonathan, Saul's own son and heir to the throne, saw in David not a rival, but a friend given by God. Their souls were knit together in a bond of trust, each vowing to protect the other's life no matter the cost. Jonathan's loyalty shone all the brighter against the backdrop of his father's envy, a living testimony that true friendship is not threatened by another's calling, but rejoices in it. David, too, remained steadfast. Though he fled from Saul's spear and schemes, though his name was sung more loudly in the streets than Saul's, he would not lift his hand against the king. Again and again, opportunities arose when David might have struck Saul down, in the darkness of a cave, in the stillness of a sleeping camp, but each time David stayed his hand. "I will not touch the Lord's anointed," he whispered, a vow of reverence for the God who had placed Saul on the throne. Through Saul's jealousy and Jonathan's loyalty, the quiet lesson of God's protection unfolded. No spear, no scheme, no number of soldiers could thwart what God had purposed for David's life. The same God who had chosen him in the fields of Bethlehem guided his every step, even through the wilderness of betrayal and pursuit. In the caves where David hid, his heart was schooled in trust, and his psalms became the songs of all who wait on God's deliverance. "You are my hiding place. You will protect me from trouble and surround me with songs of deliverance." In the end, Saul's jealousy brought him no closer to securing his throne, for what God gives cannot be taken by human striving. And David, pursued yet preserved, learned that true safety lies not in the absence of enemies but in the presence of the Lord. David's life, once marked by the music of the court and the laughter of friendship, shifted into one of shadows and exile, a wandering existence shaped by danger and constant pursuit. The king who had once welcomed him now sought his life, and the fields of Bethlehem were no longer a refuge. With each passing day, the weight of Saul's jealousy pressed heavier, and David found himself moving from town to town, then from the towns to the wild places, until even the wilderness became his dwelling place. He fled to rocky hillsides and barren valleys where the wind howled like a living thing, carrying with it the cries of creatures unseen. Nights were spent beneath star-filled skies, where the cold seeped through his cloak and the distant sounds of pursuit reminded him that rest could never be taken for granted. There were caves deep in the hills of Adullam where darkness itself seemed to wrap around him like a second skin, places where he gathered the outcasts and the broken, men burdened by debt and discontent, who found in David a leader worth following. From one hiding place to another, David learned that safety was not in walls or weapons but in the unseen shelter of the Lord. His voice, once lifted in songs of triumph in Saul's court, now echoed softly through the caverns as psalms of longing, trust, and lament. "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in you my soul takes refuge. In the shadow of your wings, I will take refuge until the disaster has passed." He would pray, the words rising like incense from a heart hemmed in by enemies. Foreign lands, too, became part of his journey. He sought asylum in Gath, among the Philistines, once the enemies he had faced in battle. To survive, he wore the guise of a man and, letting saliva run down his beard and scratching at the gates, a humiliating act that spared his life. Later, he wandered further, always a step ahead of Saul's relentless pursuit, always bearing the unseen anointing that marked him as Israel's future king. The wilderness became both a crucible and a classroom, shaping in David the faith that no palace could teach. He learned to listen for God in the rustle of leaves, to trust the one who provided food and water in the most desolate places, and to find strength not in his growing band of warriors, but in the unwavering presence of the Lord who had called him. Each narrow escape, each night spent in the company of fear, deepened his dependence on the God who had promised him a kingdom. There came moments in David's wilderness journey when the relentless chase of Saul reached its peak, and yet the hand of the Lord turned pursuit into providence. Twice, the one who sought David's life was delivered into David's own hands, and twice David, with the quiet strength of a heart anchored in God, chose mercy over vengeance. The first came in the caves of En-Gedi, where limestone cliffs rose like sentinels over the rugged desert. Saul, with 3,000 chosen men, hunted David among the crags and fissures, unaware that the very cave he entered to rest held David and his companions hidden in the shadows. The air was thick with tension, the whispers of David's men urging him to strike. "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hands.'" But David's heart trembled, not with fear, but with reverence. He crept forward and silently cut the corner of Saul's robe, a simple act that spoke volumes. Even this gesture pricked his conscience, for he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. As Saul departed, David emerged from the darkness into the blinding sunlight, holding the piece of cloth aloft. His voice carried across the valley, steady and clear. "My lord the king, why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? See, my father, the corner of your robe in my hand. I cut it off but did not kill you." Saul, moved and momentarily softened, wept and called David righteous, acknowledging that David would indeed one day be king. Yet the pursuit resumed, and again Saul's army closed in, this time in the wilderness of Ziph. By night, David and Abishai crept into the heart of Saul's camp, where the king slept with his spear stuck in the ground by his head. Abishai whispered eagerly, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of the spear." But again David stilled his companion's hand. "Do not destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, the Lord himself will strike him, or his time will come, or he will fall in battle. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on him." Instead, David took the spear and water jug from Saul's side, tokens of life spared. When dawn broke, David called out from a safe distance, displaying the spear and jug as proof. Saul's voice, weary and broken, answered with reluctant recognition, "I have sinned. May you be blessed, David my son. You will do great things and surely triumph." And again David's choice was clear. His trust was not in the end of Saul's pursuit by his own hand, but in the justice and timing of the God who had anointed him. These moments etched deep into David's soul the lesson that true strength is not in taking what is within reach, but in waiting upon the Lord. Twice he held the power to end his flight and claim the throne, yet twice he laid it down, choosing to honor the one who lifts up and casts down kings. In the hush of those wilderness nights, as the firelight flickered against the cave walls, David's psalms found new depth, songs of trust in a God whose plans unfold in their own perfect time. In the lonely years of David's exile, when the wilderness became both his refuge and his proving ground, others began to gather around him, men weary of Saul's reign, men who bore the weight of debt, distress, and discontent. They came not because David held a throne or a crown, but because something in his life, marked by the favor of God, drew them. One by one, they sought him out in the caves of Adullam, that hidden fortress in the Judean hills, until David found himself no longer a solitary fugitive but the captain of a company. 400 men became 600, bound together not by circumstance alone, but by loyalty forged in the shared trials of their wandering. These men, later called David's mighty men, were not born of nobility. They were shaped in the crucible of hardship. Among them were warriors of uncommon courage, Joshua-Basshebeth, who once lifted his spear against 800 foes and prevailed. Eleazar, who fought until his hand, cramped and swollen, clung to his sword. Shammah, who stood his ground in a field of lentils and turned the tide of battle. They were men who, like their leader, trusted not in the might of their own arms but in the faithfulness of the Lord who fought for them. Yet their bond with David was more than military allegiance. These were men who had seen him choose mercy over vengeance, who had watched him refuse to strike Saul though given opportunity twice. They knew their leader's heart, a heart that feared God above all else, that led not by tyranny but by example. In his presence they found purpose, and in his cause they found a glimpse of the kingdom yet to come, a kingdom not yet visible but already alive in the hearts of those who followed him. There were moments that etched their devotion deep. Once, when the Philistines held Bethlehem, David, weary and thirsty, sighed aloud. Oh, that someone would give me water to drink from the well by the gate of Bethlehem. At his word, 3 of his men slipped through enemy lines, drew water from that well, and brought it back. Yet David, moved to awe by their loyalty, would not drink it. He poured it out before the Lord, saying, "Far be it from me, O Lord, to do this. Shall I drink the blood of the men who risked their lives?" His refusal was not rejection, but reverence, for he saw their act not as mere loyalty to him, but as devotion worthy of offering back to God. Around their fires, in the long nights of hiding, stories of courage and faith were told, and songs were sung, some of David's own psalms, born in the quiet hours when fear pressed close and the nearness of God pressed closer still. These men, hardened by battle yet softened by loyalty, became a living testament to what God could build even in the wilderness. In time, their number and strength grew, not through conquest or ambition, but through the slow weaving of trust, faith, and shared destiny. They would one day form the backbone of David's kingdom, the warriors who secured his throne. But for now they were wanderers, finding their place in the shadow of God's anointed, learning the same lessons he was learning, that true greatness is forged not in palaces but in caves, not through seizing power but through surrendering to the one who gives it. And so the caves of Adullam, which had once been a place of hiding, became a sanctuary of fellowship, where broken men were made strong, outcasts were gathered, and a band of warriors was knit together by the unseen hand of the Lord. Even here, in the margins of the wilderness, the seeds of a kingdom were being sown, watered by faith and tended by the God who turns fugitives into leaders and the forgotten into mighty men. In the stillness of the wilderness, where the wind whispered through the barren hills and the stars shone unshaken above, David's soul poured itself out in song. Far from the courts of Saul and the pastures of his youth, he found himself dwelling in the margins of the world, hiding among the caves and rocky crags of the Judean desert. And yet, even in this place of exile, the nearness of God was not diminished. In the absence of human security, the presence of the Lord became his refuge, a fortress stronger than any stone walls. Night after night, as his men slept and the crackle of their small fires faded into silence, David would take up his harp, the same instrument that once brought peace to Saul's troubled spirit, and let his fingers draw music from the strings. Words of longing and trust spilled from his heart, words that would one day become the psalms that countless generations would carry upon their own lips. I lift my eyes to the hills, from where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Each note, each whispered prayer, became an act of faith, a reminder to his own heart that the God who anointed him had not abandoned him. In the loneliness of those hidden places, David discovered the depth of his need for the Lord. Surrounded by danger, hunted by Saul's relentless pursuit, and burdened by the weight of leadership over men who looked to him for direction, David turned again and again to the one who never faltered. "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, of whom shall I be afraid?" These were not the declarations of a man untouched by fear, but the cries of one who found courage in the presence of God. His songs were not always triumphant. Some carried the raw honesty of a heart laid bare before its maker. "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" Yet even in the Psalms where his anguish spilled out like water, a thread of hope wove its way through the verses, a steady turning back to trust. "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me." These lonely songs became the forge of David's faith. Each trial deepened his reliance on the Lord, teaching him that true security was not found in fortresses or armies, but in the steadfast love of God. He learned to wait upon the Lord, to find rest not in the end of his trials, but in the presence of the one who walked with him through them. Sometimes, as dawn broke over the desert and the first light of day painted the hills with gold, David's men would wake to the sound of his voice, soft yet resolute, rising with the morning wind. They could not always understand the words, but they felt the peace that seemed to settle over him, a peace that, in turn, touched them as well. It was as if, through David's communion with God, they too were reminded that their wandering was not without purpose, that the same hand which held their leader also held them. In these songs of longing and trust, David came to know God not only as the one who had chosen him for kingship, but as his shepherd, his shield, and his closest friend. Out of the caves and wild places of his exile flowed the words that would one day bring comfort to countless hearts. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. The wilderness years left their mark on David, not only shaping the warrior and king he would become, but leaving behind a legacy of worship that continues to echo through time. For in those lonely places, when everything else was stripped away, David discovered the unshakable foundation of his life, the presence of the living God. And from that foundation came a peace that no enemy could take, a joy that no circumstance could overshadow, and a trust that, once kindled, could not be extinguished. Under the heavy skies of Gilboa, where the mountains cast long shadows over the trembling earth, the last chapter of Saul's reign began to unfold. The Philistine threat that had long pressed against Israel's borders had gathered its strength for one final, decisive blow. Their army stretched like a dark tide across the plain, a sea of iron chariots and seasoned warriors, their banners snapping in the wind. From the heights, Saul looked down upon the host below, and a heavy dread settled upon his spirit, not the sharp fear of battle, but the hollow weight of a man who knows the Lord's favor has departed. He had known moments of courage once, when the Spirit of God came upon him with power, when his voice had commanded and his arm had struck with the confidence of divine calling. But those days were gone. In their place lingered a silence more crushing than any enemy's shout, a silence that no prophet's counsel, no priestly rite, and no desperate prayer could seem to break. Even the night before the battle, when the camp lay still beneath the stars, Saul had sought the Lord and heard nothing. No dream came to comfort him, no vision to guide him, no word to strengthen his trembling heart. With a soul weighed down by fear and regret, Saul turned instead to the forbidden, seeking out the voice of Samuel through the whisper of a medium's conjuring. Yet even in that haunted echo, no comfort came, only the chilling confirmation of what Saul already knew. His kingdom would not endure, and his life, along with the lives of his sons, would soon be demanded on the battlefield. Morning came, and with it the sound of the Philistines advancing like an unrelenting storm. The clash began at the foot of Mount Gilboa, iron against iron, the cries of the wounded mingling with the blare of horns and the thundering of feet upon the dry earth. Saul fought with the desperation of a man cornered, his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, by his side, their swords rising and falling in a furious rhythm. But the enemy pressed harder, and one by one, his sons fell, their lifeblood staining the ground. Jonathan, the faithful son whose soul had been bound to David in loyal friendship, fell that day, his courage undimmed to the end. And with each of his sons struck down, Saul's world grew smaller, the walls of his destiny closing in. Wounded by enemy archers, his strength draining, Saul staggered back toward the rocky slopes of Gilboa. The Philistines pressed close, and the king, knowing capture was certain, turned to his armor-bearer. "Draw your sword and thrust me through, lest these uncircumcised men come and abuse me," he pleaded. But the young man, overcome by fear and loyalty, could not lift his hand against his master. So Saul, the man once anointed by the prophet's hand, the man who had stood head and shoulders above all Israel, took his own sword and fell upon it. His armor-bearer, seeing his king dead, followed him into death. And thus ended the reign of Israel's first king, his body lying lifeless on the slopes of Gilboa, a stark reminder of the cost of turning away from the Lord's heart. When the Philistines came upon the fallen king, they stripped his armor, cut off his head, and sent word throughout their land, proclaiming their victory in the temples of their gods. Saul's body, along with those of his sons, was fastened to the walls of Beth-shan in grim display. Yet even in death, the Lord preserved his dignity through the bravery of men from Jabesh Gilead, who traveled by night to retrieve the bodies, carrying them away for an honorable burial. As the sun set over Gilboa, casting a final, blood-red glow across the battlefield, the chapter of Saul's kingship closed, heavy with the weight of unfulfilled promise. Israel mourned, and with that mourning came the quiet turning of the page in God's unfolding story. For though Saul's reign had ended, the Lord's plan had not. News of the battle came to David not with the clamor of victory, but with the hollow ache of loss carried on the lips of a trembling messenger. He had returned from defeating the Amalekites, his heart still stirred by the weight of war, when an Amalekite came to him at Ziklag, his clothes torn, dust upon his head, the marks of mourning. The man fell to the ground before David and delivered the words that seemed to still the very air. Saul and Jonathan were dead, fallen on the slopes of Gilboa. The news struck David like a blow, for though Saul had pursued him with relentless jealousy, hurling spears and sending soldiers in the long years of exile, David had never ceased to honor him as the Lord's anointed. And Jonathan was the brother of his heart, the friend whose covenant love had been a steady light through the darkest nights. The messenger's account unfolded with each breath, the man claiming to have ended Saul's life at the king's own request. David listened in silence, his gaze heavy with grief. And when the tale was done, he tore his clothes, and all who were with him did the same. There was no satisfaction in the downfall of an enemy, no triumph in the death of a king who had made his life a wilderness. Instead, David wept. He wept for Saul, the man chosen and anointed by God, who had once stood tall in Israel and led the people to victory. He wept for Jonathan, whose soul had been knit to his in unbreakable friendship, the friend who had risked everything to stand by him. He wept for the people of Israel, now leaderless and exposed to their enemies. Grief became a river that poured itself into song, and in that song, David gave voice to the nation's sorrow. He commanded that the Song of the Bow be taught throughout Judah, a lament that would preserve the memory of Saul and Jonathan for generations to come. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your heights. How the mighty have fallen! Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and admired, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle! Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished. In the stillness that followed, David's song became the people's mourning. Across Israel, men and women repeated the refrain, How the mighty have fallen, their voices rising like incense with the grief of a nation. The lament was more than memory, it was an act of honor. In the death of Saul, David refused the poison of bitterness. In the death of Jonathan, he kept the sacred bond of their friendship alive in the only way left to him, by remembering, by giving words to love that no enemy's sword could sever. Even as he grieved, David's heart turned toward the God who weaves all things into his sovereign plan. He did not rush to claim the throne that now lay vacant, for his mourning was true and unfeigned. For days he and his men fasted, allowing sorrow its place before the next chapter of his calling unfolded. And in the deep of that grief, the words of his lament lingered, a song of honor for the fallen, a benediction for the faithful friend who had walked beside him, and a reminder to the people of Israel that even in their darkest hour, the Lord remained their true king. After the lament had been sung and the days of mourning had passed, David sought the Lord, as he had done in every crossroad of his life. In the quiet of his heart, beneath the weight of grief and the lingering scent of loss, he asked, "Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" And the voice of the Lord, steady and unchanging, whispered back, "Go up." "Where shall I go?" he asked again, his spirit waiting for the sure direction only God could give. "To Hebron," came the reply. So David rose with his men and their households, leaving behind the ashes of Ziklag to settle in the hill country of Judah. It was there, among his own people, that the men of Judah came to him. They saw in David not merely the warrior who had struck down Goliath, not merely the fugitive who had been hunted through wilderness and cave, but the man God himself had chosen. And they anointed him king over the house of Judah. It was a quiet coronation compared to the pomp and power of other nations. No golden throne, no sprawling palace, no trumpets blaring from city walls. Yet in that moment, the promise that had once flowed from Samuel's horn of oil in the fields of Bethlehem began to take root. David, the shepherd king after God's own heart, now led a portion of the people he had long loved and served. But the path to the fullness of God's promise would not come without trial. For even as David reigned in Hebron, the house of Saul clung to power. Abner, commander of Saul's army, raised up Ishbosheth, Saul's son, as king over Israel. For years, the kingdom was divided, Judah under David, the rest of Israel under the shadow of Saul's house. Skirmishes flared, and the land knew the bitter taste of civil war. Yet through it all, David refused to take by force what God had promised in his own time. He waited, as he had always waited, trusting the hand of the Lord to shape his destiny. For David's kingship was never about ambition, it was about obedience. He had been anointed in secret as a boy, chosen not for stature or might but for the heart that beat in rhythm with God's own. And now, even with a crown upon his head, David's deepest allegiance remained unchanged. His trust was not in armies or alliances, but in the faithfulness of the Lord who had called him. In time, the house of Saul grew weaker, and the Lord's favor upon David became ever more evident. Abner himself, once Saul's staunchest supporter, came to recognize the inevitability of God's plan. He sought peace with David, pledging to bring all Israel under his reign. Yet even as the tides turned, the land bore the scars of division, and David's heart carried the weight of a people still fractured. Then, at last, the elders of Israel came to Hebron. Men from every tribe, those who had once followed Saul, those who had long known David, gathered before the shepherd king. They spoke words that rang with the truth of history and the certainty of God's hand. "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, even while Saul was king, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.'" In that sacred moment, they anointed David king over all Israel. The divided kingdom was made whole, and David, once the shepherd boy of Bethlehem, now stood as the shepherd of a nation. The promise whispered in the solitude of the fields, confirmed in the anointing of Samuel, and tempered in the long wilderness years had finally blossomed into reality. David made Jerusalem his capital, capturing the stronghold of Zion and establishing it as the city of David, not for his own glory, but that the name of the Lord might dwell in the midst of his people. There, amid the hills and valleys that had borne witness to centuries of longing, a united Israel found its center. And David reigned, not as a perfect king, for he too would stumble and fall, but as a man who sought the heart of God, leading his people in the knowledge that the true King of Israel was the Lord himself. In the soft quiet of the night, one could imagine David stepping out onto the terrace of his new home, the city below him bathed in starlight. The crown upon his head was but a symbol. His true calling was the same as it had always been, to shepherd God's people with a heart of trust and a hand guided by the Almighty. He looked up to the same heavens under which he had once sung as a boy in the fields of Bethlehem, and perhaps the same song rose again on his lips, a psalm of praise to the one who exalts the humble and fulfills his promises in his perfect time. Under the canopy of a starlit sky, Jerusalem lay nestled among its hills, a city of ancient walls and storied past, waiting for the one who would claim it not by brute force alone, but by the calling of God. David had known years of wandering, seasons of waiting, and battles fought not only against enemies of flesh and blood but against doubt, despair, and the temptation to take by his own hand what only the Lord could give. Now, crowned king over all Israel, he stood at the threshold of uniting a people long divided, a shepherd called to gather every scattered flock under one guiding hand. The path to unity was neither simple nor swift. The tribes of Israel had walked their own paths for generations, each carrying its memories of faith and failure, each shaped by the landscapes and stories of its inheritance. For years, old loyalties and lingering wounds had kept them apart, wounds carved by the reign of Saul, by civil war, by the deep fissures left in the wake of mistrust. Yet now the elders of every tribe had come to David, their words echoing the promises of God. "You shall shepherd my people Israel, and you shall be ruler over them." David set his heart on a city that belonged to none of the tribes yet stood at the heart of the land, Jerusalem, the Jebusite stronghold perched high upon Mount Zion. Its inhabitants boasted of its impenetrable walls, declaring with pride that even the blind and the lame could defend it against any invader. But David, carrying the quiet assurance of one led by the Lord, saw not what was, but what could be. For this city, ancient and unclaimed, was destined to be the place where the name of the Lord would dwell, a beacon of unity for the people of God. With the strength of his men and the surety of divine favor, David captured the fortress of Zion. The city that once mocked his ascent now bore his name, the city of David, not for conquest's sake, but as a living testimony to the God who establishes his purposes. From that day forward, Jerusalem became the heartbeat of a united kingdom, its walls sheltering a people knit together by promise and purpose. In the days that followed, David made Jerusalem his home, fortifying its walls, building his palace, and preparing a place for the Ark of God. Yet even in his victories, David did not forget the source of his strength. Each stone laid, each wall raised, bore silent witness to a deeper truth. It was not the city that made the king great, but the presence of the Lord dwelling in the midst of his people. As the city grew, so too did the unity of Israel. Tribes that had once stood in opposition now found themselves bound together under the banner of a king who sought not his own glory, but the will of God. Warriors who had once drawn swords against one another now stood shoulder to shoulder, their loyalty no longer to divided houses but to a shared covenant. Farmers in the northern hills, shepherds in the southern pastures, priests ministering in the sacred places, all lifted their eyes to Jerusalem, the city of peace, where David reigned as a shepherd king. In the quiet hours of the night, David would often ascend the terraces of his new home. The city lay before him, its lamps flickering like stars against the darkened hills, and beyond it stretched the land promised to Abraham's descendants, now united at last. In such moments, perhaps David's heart returned to the fields of his youth, to the nights when he had sung to his sheep beneath an open sky, unaware of the path that lay ahead. The same stars shone above him now, silent witnesses to the faithfulness of the God who had led him from pasture to palace. Yet David knew the work was not finished. Uniting the kingdom was not merely a matter of walls and treaties, it was a matter of hearts turning toward the Lord. The city of David would one day become the dwelling place of the Ark, a symbol of God's presence among his people, and in this, David saw the true purpose of his reign, to lead a united Israel not simply in name, but in devotion to the one who had always been their true king. Thus Jerusalem stood, no longer a Jebusite fortress but the city chosen to bear witness to the faithfulness of God. It was a city of promise, a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet, where the prayers of a united people rose like incense into the night. And in the stillness of those sacred hours, David's heart echoed the words of his own psalms. The Lord builds up Jerusalem, he gathers the exiles of Israel. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. For in uniting the kingdom and establishing Jerusalem, David had not simply secured a throne. He had taken the next step in the unfolding story of redemption, a story that whispered of a greater king yet to come, one who would reign not only over a nation, but over every heart willing to call him Lord. Under the soft glow of dawn, when the first light spread across the hills of Israel, the sound of footsteps echoed in the valleys. Not the frantic tread of a people fleeing before their foes, but the measured march of soldiers returning home, their banners lifted high, their songs of victory rising like incense to the heavens. After years of uncertainty, of battles fought and bonds tested, Israel now stood under the steady hand of a king chosen by God, and the land, for the first time in generations, tasted the sweetness of security. David, once the shepherd who had defended his father's flocks with sling and staff, now bore the mantle of a warrior king, leading the armies of Israel not with pride in his own strength, but with unwavering trust in the Lord who had delivered him from lions, bears, and giants. Time and again, the enemies that had long plagued Israel rose against them, Philistines pressing in from the west, Moabites and Edomites harrying the borders, Ammonites stirring rebellion, and time and again, the Lord granted victory. With each campaign, the reach of Israel's kingdom extended, and the shadow of fear that had hung over the people began to lift like morning mist before the sun. But these were not conquests for conquest's sake. David's heart was set not on amassing glory for himself, but on establishing a kingdom where the name of the Lord would be honored and his people could dwell in safety. After every battle, it was not the spoils of war that held his gaze, but the presence of God that guided his steps. Returning from the field, he would pause in the stillness of his chambers, laying aside the blood-stained cloak of a warrior and taking up the harp of a shepherd once more, his fingers coaxing melodies of thanksgiving and praise from familiar strings. The strength of David's kingdom lay not merely in fortified walls or well-trained soldiers, but in the favor of the Lord that rested upon him. The people knew it, sensing in their king a reflection of the one who was their true defender. Fields that had once lain desolate beneath the threat of raiding bands now yielded abundant harvests. Cities scarred by years of conflict hummed with the rhythms of daily life, merchants in the marketplaces, children laughing in the streets, priests lifting prayers from the sanctuaries. For the first time in years, a deep and lasting peace settled over the land, and with it came the quiet confidence that God was with them. David's victories were also victories of the heart. He led not as a tyrant who ruled by fear, but as a shepherd who guided with care. His justice was tempered with mercy, his decrees rooted in the law of the Lord. Around the great table of his council, voices once divided by tribal allegiance now joined in shaping the future of a united nation. Warriors who had fought under different banners now shared the same stories of valor, bound by loyalty not only to David but to the God who had brought them together. There were nights when David would stand upon the walls of Jerusalem, gazing out at the land stretching in every direction, the distant mountains bathed in moonlight, the valleys threaded with rivers like silver ribbons, the villages glowing with lamplight. In those quiet hours, he felt the weight of all that had been entrusted to him, a weight made lighter by the knowledge that he did not bear it alone. "The Lord is my strength and my shield," he would whisper, recalling the words of the Psalms that had once been his only companions in the wilderness. Yet even in times of triumph, David did not forget the source of his victories. Each success deepened his desire to build a house for the Lord, a dwelling place where the Ark of the Covenant could rest and the people could gather to worship the God who had delivered them. Though the battles had brought him renown, it was not the acclaim of nations that stirred his heart, but the thought of a kingdom firmly established in righteousness, where every victory pointed not to the might of the king but to the faithfulness of the one who reigned above all. And so the years of conflict gave way to a season of strength and stability, the land knit together by shared faith and hard-won peace. The people of Israel, once scattered and vulnerable, now walked with heads held high, their lives no longer shadowed by constant fear. And in the midst of their joy, David's heart swelled with gratitude, not for the throne he occupied or the power he wielded, but for the grace of the God who had lifted him from shepherd's fields to the seat of a king, that he might shepherd a nation into the safety of his promises. Under the hush of a tranquil evening, when the torches of Jerusalem flickered against the darkened sky and the scent of cedarwood lingered in the palace halls, David would find himself lingering in the quiet places, far from the clamor of courtly duties and the echoes of recent victories. There, in the stillness, his heart would turn again and again toward one longing that no crown could satisfy, no triumph could silence: the desire to build a house for the Lord. For years, David had carried the Ark of the Covenant from place to place, housed in tents as it had been since the days of Moses. Even now, as Jerusalem stood united and the kingdom flourished in strength, the Ark, the visible sign of God's presence, rested in a tabernacle of cloth and poles. David, who lived in a palace of cedar and stone, would gaze at the simple dwelling of the Ark and feel a stirring deep within him. Was it right that the King of Glory should dwell in something so humble, while he himself sat in splendor? On nights when sleep would not come, David would pace the palace rooftop, his thoughts tracing the story of God's faithfulness, how the Lord had taken him from shepherding his father's sheep in the Bethlehem hills to shepherding an entire nation. His heart swelled with gratitude, and yet with that gratitude came an unshakable yearning to create a place worthy of the one who had lifted him from the pasture to the throne. He longed for a dwelling where the people of Israel could gather in reverence, their voices rising in unison to honor the God who had led them through wilderness and war into peace. It was not ambition that fueled this desire, nor the hope of leaving behind a monument to his own reign. David's deepest joy had never been in the trappings of power but in the presence of the Lord. The palace walls around him, grand as they were, felt empty compared to the tent that housed the Ark. His psalms bore witness to the longing that consumed him. "One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple." In the intimacy of prayer, David poured out his desire before God, speaking not as a king before his sovereign but as a servant before his master. He envisioned a house where the walls would resound with songs of praise, where the light of countless lamps would chase away the darkness, and where the very air would carry the fragrance of offerings lifted in devotion. He pictured generations yet unborn walking its courtyards, learning the stories of God's mighty deeds and finding their own hearts drawn nearer to the one who dwelt in their midst. Yet, even as this desire grew, the Lord's answer came with a gentleness that both humbled and comforted David. The task of building the temple would not be his to complete. He was a man of war, his hands marked by the battles that had secured the peace Israel now enjoyed. The temple, the Lord declared, would be built by his son, a king of peace whose reign would be marked not by the clash of swords but by the stillness of prosperity. Far from disappointment, David received this word with reverence. For him, the joy was not in the fulfillment of his own plans, but in aligning his heart with the purposes of God. If he could not build the temple, then he would prepare for it with all his strength. He began gathering materials, gold and silver, cedar and stone, each piece set aside as an offering of love. He composed songs that would one day fill its courts and organized the Levites who would minister there, ensuring that the worship of God would flourish long after his own reign had ended. Often, in the quiet of evening, David would take up his harp and sing to the Lord, his voice carrying through the stillness of the palace, songs of gratitude, of longing, of anticipation for the day when the dwelling place of God would stand in the heart of the city. And though he knew the temple itself would not rise in his lifetime, he took comfort in the promise that the presence of the Lord would continue to rest upon his people, guiding and sustaining them as it always had. This desire, not for a monument of stone, but for a home where heaven and earth would meet, revealed the true nature of David's heart. It was the heart of a shepherd king who, even at the height of his power, found his deepest joy not in the grandeur of his throne but in drawing closer to the one who had been his refuge in the fields, his deliverer in battle, and his friend in the stillness of the night. And so, the longing to build a house for the Lord remained the quiet fire that burned within him, shaping his reign and directing his steps. For David knew that the strength of Israel lay not in its walls or its armies, but in the presence of the living God, a presence he longed to honor with every breath, every victory, every heartbeat of his life. Under the stillness of a starlit Jerusalem night, when the city slept in the gentle hush of evening, David walked alone upon the roof of his palace. The day's noise had faded, and the cool air carried with it the sense of cedar and stone. Yet for all the peace surrounding him, an unease stirred within his heart, a restlessness that the victories of battle and the honors of kingship could not quiet. It was then, in a moment both ordinary and fateful, that his gaze fell upon her, a woman bathing in the privacy of her home, unaware that she was seeing. Her name was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, a man of valor among David's own warriors. Beauty such as hers should have inspired respect, a turning away of the eyes and reverence for the sanctity of her life. But temptation, swift and unrelenting, gripped David's heart. Desire gave birth to thought, and thought to action. Messengers were sent. Bathsheba was brought to the palace. In that moment, the man after God's own heart stepped outside the shelter of obedience, seeking fulfillment apart from the one who had given him all. What followed was a shadowed chapter in David's life, a chain of choices that wove deceit upon deceit. When Bathsheba later sent word that she was with child, fear whispered its counsel, and David listened. To cover what had been done, he summoned Uriah from the battlefield, hoping the man's return to his wife would conceal the truth. But Uriah, loyal to his fellow soldiers and to the ark of God, refused the comforts of home while his brothers slept in open fields. Frustration turned David's heart toward a darker path. A sealed letter was sent by Uriah's own hand, a command to Joab, the commander of David's army: place Uriah at the front of the fiercest battle, then withdraw from him, that he may fall. And so it was. Uriah died not by the sword of the enemy, but by the betrayal of the king he served. In the quiet aftermath, Bathsheba mourned her husband, and David, believing the matter hidden, took her as his wife. Outwardly, the king's life continued, songs of victory still filled the streets, and the kingdom remained at peace. Yet within David's heart, a shadow lingered. The God who saw him in the fields as a shepherd, who lifted him to the throne, also saw the darkness that had taken root. Then came the prophet Nathan, bearing a story. He spoke of a rich man who, despite having many flocks, took the one treasured lamb of a poor man to feed a guest. David, hearing the tale, burned with anger. As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. Nathan's reply pierced like an arrow. You are the man. In that moment, the weight of David's sin descended fully upon him. All his defenses crumbled, and he stood bare before the God he had betrayed. Yet even in judgment, mercy was near. David confessed with a broken spirit, I have sinned against the Lord. And the Lord, abundant in compassion, forgave him, though the consequences of his choices would echo through his household. From this place of repentance came some of the most heartfelt psalms ever penned, prayers that rise like incense from the ashes of regret. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion blot out my transgressions. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. David learned that true restoration is not found in hiding sin, but in bringing it into the light. In the depths of failure, he discovered again the unfathomable mercy of God, a mercy that does not discard the repentant, but lifts them from the dust and clothes them in grace. And so, even in this darkest chapter, the heart of the shepherd king turned once more toward the one who had always been his refuge. His story reminds us that no fall is beyond redemption, no heart so stained that it cannot be made new in the hands of the living God. Nathan's rebuke came like a thunderclap on a cloudless day, sudden, clear, and unavoidable. David, still carrying the hidden weight of his actions, had lived these past months under the illusion that his choices were buried, that time had covered what conscience could not cleanse. But the Lord, who had anointed him as king and walked with him through valleys and victories, would not leave him to wander in the darkness of unrepented sin. Nathan, the prophet and friend of the king, entered David's presence not with accusations shouted in anger, but with a story, a gentle snare woven of truth and parable. He told of a rich man who, despite having many flocks, took the one precious lamb of a poor man, the lamb that had eaten from his hand, drunk from his cup, and slept in his arms like a daughter. The injustice of it struck David's heart like a stone. Anger flared, righteous and indignant. As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. Then Nathan's words, sharp as a sword, cut through the air. You are the man. In that instant, all pretense fell away. The veil of self-deception was torn, and David stood exposed before the Holy One who sees all. The story was his, the theft his own, the sin laid bare not by human accusation, but by divine light. There was no escape, no defense to mount. Only the crushing reality of his own guilt remained. Yet even in this moment of piercing confrontation, grace was present. For the God who sent Nathan did so not to destroy David, but to draw him back. Conviction is a severe mercy, a wound meant to heal, a piercing meant to remove the poison of sin. David's heart, tender to the voice of God even in its darkest hour, broke open. I have sinned against the Lord, he confessed. No excuses, no shifting of blame, only a soul laid bare before its Maker. Nathan's reply held both judgment and mercy. The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. The weight of those words settled heavily upon David. Sin, though forgiven, still bore consequences. Yet the assurance of pardon, that the God he had betrayed would still receive him, was a mercy beyond comprehension. In the days that followed, David turned to the only refuge he had ever truly known, the presence of God. From his brokenness rose words that would echo through the ages, finding voice in the Psalms that countless souls have prayed in their own hours of failure and repentance. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. These were not the words of a man seeking to escape consequences, but the cry of a heart that longed to be made whole again. David knew that what he needed most was not the restoration of his reputation or his throne, but the renewal of his inner being. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me from your presence, or take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me. In those lines, the shepherd king bared his soul, a man who, though he had fallen grievously, still believed in the mercy of the one who had chosen him. The Psalms of this season breathe the language of brokenness transformed into worship. They are the prayers of a man who had walked through the valley of his own sin and found that even there, the shepherd's rod and staff still guided him. They remind us that repentance is not a one-time act, but a posture of the heart, a turning again and again toward the God whose love is deeper than our deepest failings. David's story does not hide his sin, nor does it leave him in despair. Instead, it traces the arc of a soul that, when confronted by its own darkness, chooses to run not away from God, but toward Him. In doing so, David discovered what countless others would come to know, that the heart of the Lord is quick to forgive, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. In the quiet of his chamber, perhaps with tears staining the floor where he knelt, David's voice rose not in the triumphant songs of battle, but in the trembling melody of repentance. And heaven, leaning close, heard the contrite whisper of a king who had learned anew that the sacrifices God desires are a broken spirit and a heart that does not hide from his gaze. Absalom's rebellion did not come like a sudden storm, but like a slow shadow creeping across David's house, a shadow born of broken relationships and unhealed wounds. Absalom, the handsome and charismatic son of the king, carried a quiet fire in his heart, a fire stoked by bitterness and a desire for justice twisted into ambition. For years, pain had brewed beneath the surface of David's household, the unresolved grief over his sister Tamar's tragedy, the complicated dynamics of a family marked by many wives and many sons, and a father's love stretched thin by the weight of a kingdom. Absalom began to win the hearts of the people in the quiet spaces between official decrees and public judgments. Standing by the city gate, he listened to grievances with the warmth of one who understood, offering promises of fairness and justice. "If only I were appointed judge in the land," he would say, "then everyone who has a complaint or case could come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide of loyalty shifted. People began to see Absalom as the one who might bring them what they longed for, a king who seemed approachable, who whispered of a better future. David, older now, felt the strain of years and the burdens of kingship pressing heavily upon him. Perhaps he saw the signs of Absalom's growing influence, yet chose to hope that the love of a father would hold his son close. But the seeds of rebellion, once sown, grew swiftly. When Absalom declared himself king in Hebron and the trumpet blasts echoed through the land, David knew the pain of betrayal in its deepest form, not from an enemy, but from his own blood. Forced to flee Jerusalem, the city he had taken with such triumph in earlier days, David crossed the Kidron Valley barefoot, his head covered in grief. Loyal followers wept as they went with him, and the hearts of the people were torn between father and son. Each step of that exile carried a weight heavier than any armor he had ever worn, the weight of a father whose own child sought his throne. Yet even in his anguish, David turned his heart toward the Lord. He sent the Ark of God back to Jerusalem, refusing to use the holy presence as a talisman for his cause. "If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back," he said. "But if he says, 'I am not pleased with you,' then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." In the wilderness once more, David prayed with the same trust that had sustained him in earlier years. His psalms from this season carry the language of a heart torn yet anchored. "Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high." The rebellion reached its bitter climax in the forest of Ephraim. Absalom, riding in pursuit of his father's men, became caught in the branches of a great oak, his long hair tangled, his life hanging between earth and sky. Joab, David's commander, struck him down, ignoring the king's plea to deal gently with the young man Absalom. When word reached David that his son was dead, his grief spilled out in a cry that has echoed through the centuries. "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" It was not the cry of a king for a rebel, but of a father for his child, a lament that mingled the sorrow of betrayal with the undying love of a parent. Absalom's rebellion left scars on David's heart and on the kingdom itself. Trust had been fractured, and the unity of Israel would never be quite the same. Yet through it all, David continued to hold fast to the God who had shepherded him from the pasture to the palace. He learned again that the throne was never truly his, it belonged to the Lord, who gives and takes away according to his will. In the stillness of the nights that followed, perhaps David reflected on the paradox of his life: victories over giants and enemies, yet wounds he could not shield himself from within his own family. And yet, even in this, he found the unchanging presence of the one who had called him as a shepherd boy. The Lord remained faithful, even when the love of sons faltered and the loyalties of men shifted like sand. Betrayal, when it comes, seldom announces itself with a roar. It arrives quietly, a blade slipped between the ribs of trust. For David, who had known the sting of spears thrown by Saul and the threats of enemies in battle, nothing pierced so deeply as the wound inflicted by those he loved. The rebellion of Absalom left behind not only a fractured kingdom but a father's heart splintered by grief. Even after the clash of armies and the silencing of the trumpets, David could not shake the echo of his own lament. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom! Would that I had died instead of you!" These were not the words of a king tallying the costs of war, but of a father mourning a life consumed by bitterness and ambition. In the days that followed, Jerusalem was subdued, its streets hushed with the uneasy quiet that comes after the breaking of something sacred. People whispered of victory, yet David could not bring himself to celebrate. To him, the cost was far too great. His throne had been preserved, but at the price of a son's life and the loyalty of hearts that had once been his. He withdrew often into the silence of his chambers, his face turned toward the God who had been his refuge since the shepherd's fields of his youth. There, where no courtiers or soldiers could see, he poured out the raw ache of a father's heart, letting grief become prayer. David knew betrayal well. He had seen it in Saul's darkened eyes, in the council chambers where loyalty turned with the shifting winds of power, and now, most painfully, in the face of his own child. Yet even in the depths of that pain, his trust in God held firm. He clung to the belief that the Lord, who had chosen him, who had delivered him from the hand of every enemy, remained sovereign over every heartbreak. "You, Lord, keep my lamp burning. My God turns my darkness into light," he whispered, the words of his own psalms now his lifeline. Betrayal carries with it a temptation, the temptation to harden the heart, to build walls so high that no one might climb them again. But David, scarred though he was, refused to surrender to bitterness. He had learned in the wilderness years that to carry vengeance or resentment is to drink poison and hope another suffers. Instead, he returned again and again to the God who had always been faithful. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He restores my soul." Even when betrayal and loss hollowed out his spirit, David found that in God's presence, restoration was still possible. The loyalty of a few remained his comfort. Jonathan, his dearest friend, was long gone, but the memory of their covenant still steadied him like a staff in a weary hand. Those who had stood with him in exile, men who had once been outcasts themselves, continued to surround him, living witnesses to the truth that God weaves fellowship even in the most desolate seasons. Yet David's truest solace came not from the company of men but from the unshakable faithfulness of the Lord. Others might turn, others might fall away, but the shepherd of his soul neither betrayed nor abandoned him. Sometimes in the stillness of night, as the torches burned low and the city lay in uneasy sleep, David would lift his harp and let his fingers trace melodies born of both pain and trust. These songs, forged in the furnace of sorrow, carried the echoes of his unbroken faith. Many are asking, "Who can show us any good? Let the light of your face shine on us, O Lord. You have filled my heart with greater joy than when their grain and new wine abound." Even in the ruins of fractured relationships, he found joy that no betrayal could steal, joy rooted not in shifting human loyalty, but in the steadfast love of God. The loss of Absalom remained a wound that never fully healed, yet David learned to live with the scar as a reminder of the frailty of earthly bonds and the constancy of divine grace. For in the end, betrayal and loss, as crushing as they were, could not erase the greater truth, that his life, his kingdom, and his hope rested not in men but in the Lord who had chosen him. In the twilight of his reign, when the years had etched lines of wisdom upon his face, and the weight of many battles lay behind him, David found himself looking upon a kingdom finally at rest. The echoes of rebellion had faded, the last enemies subdued, and the people of Israel dwelled under the shelter of hard-won peace. The journey had been long, filled with valleys of grief and peaks of triumph, yet through it all the Lord had proven himself faithful. David, once a shepherd boy with a harp and sling, now ruled a united nation, the fulfillment of promises spoken long ago beneath the star-strewn skies of Bethlehem. Even in his victories, David's heart remained tender toward the God who had carried him from obscurity to the throne. He knew that every triumph was not his own, but the Lord's, each battle won not by the strength of his arm, but by the steadfast presence of the one who had guided him since his youth. And so, as the realm prospered, his thoughts turned increasingly toward the future, toward the legacy that would remain when his voice was silent and his hands no longer held the scepter. He longed to build a house for the Lord, a temple that would rise in Jerusalem as a permanent dwelling for the God of Israel. It was a dream that had burned in his heart for years, born of gratitude and reverence. Yet the word of the Lord had come to him, gentle yet firm. David was a man of war, his hands stained by the blood of many battles. It would be his son, Solomon, who would build the house of God. Though the message pierced him with longing, David did not resist. Instead, he devoted his remaining years to preparing the way, gathering materials, drawing plans, and instructing his people so that the temple might rise in glory after his passing. In the quiet hours, David would stand upon the terraces of his palace, gazing toward the hill where the temple would one day stand. He pictured its courts filled with worshippers, the smoke of offerings rising heavenward, and the songs of Levites echoing through its halls. This vision became his final labor of love, not the conquest of new lands or the amassing of wealth, but the laying of a foundation for future generations to worship the God who had never failed him. Around him, the signs of preparation unfolded like the pages of a living psalm. Artisans carved cedar and stone, gold and silver were set aside, and the leaders of Israel were called to commit themselves to the work. David, with the fervor of a man nearing the end of his race, urged his people to serve the Lord with undivided hearts. Know the God of your fathers and serve him with wholehearted devotion and a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every desire and every thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you. These final victories were not of swords and spears, but of hearts turned toward God. David's reign, once marked by the clash of armies and the roar of battlefields, now drew to a close in the quiet triumph of a people united in worship and expectation. He had known the bitterness of betrayal, the weight of failure, and the sting of loss, yet here, at the end, he saw the faithfulness of God woven through it all, like a golden thread binding every fragment of his story into a tapestry of grace. At night, beneath the same stars that had once borne witness to his shepherd's songs, David would take up his harp and sing. His voice, though softened by age, carried the same unshakable trust. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? These songs, like prayers set to melody, were his final gifts to the people, reminders that the true strength of Israel lay not in kings or fortresses, but in the enduring presence of the Lord. As the day approached when he would lay down his crown, David found peace in the knowledge that the God who had called him from the pasture would continue to shepherd Israel. His victories, his failures, his joys, and his sorrows were now part of a story much greater than his own, a story of divine faithfulness that would echo through generations. And in that knowledge, David rested, preparing to entrust both throne and temple to the Son who would follow, and the God who would never forsake his people. In the final days of David's life, the palace was quiet, as though the very walls held their breath. The once vigorous king, whose hands had wielded the shepherd's sling and the warrior's sword, now rested upon his couch, his body frail with age, yet his spirit alight with the same flame that had burned since the days of his youth. Outside, Jerusalem stirred with the rhythm of ordinary life, but within these chambers, a sacred hush prevailed. For David, son of Jesse, beloved of the Lord, was nearing the end of his long journey, and his heart overflowed with memories of a life lived beneath the watchful gaze of God. He called for those closest to him, not with the commanding tone of a monarch, but with the quiet earnestness of a shepherd calling his flock. Around him gathered his son Solomon, the priests, and trusted attendants, their faces reflecting the solemn awareness that they were hearing the final words of Israel's greatest king. Yet David did not speak first of thrones or wars or victories. Instead, his voice, softened by time yet clear with conviction, carried the weight of a deeper truth. The Spirit of the Lord spoke by me. His word was on my tongue. The God of Israel spoke, the Rock of Israel said to me, when one rules over people in righteousness, when he rules in the fear of God, he is like the light of morning at sunrise on a cloudless morning, like the brightness after rain that brings grass from the earth. These were not the boasts of a king, but the testimony of a man who knew his strength had never been his own. David's mind wandered back to the hills of Bethlehem, where as a boy he had watched over his father's sheep, singing to the God who had shaped his heart. He remembered the day Samuel's horn of oil had poured over his head, marking him for a destiny he could not yet comprehend. He remembered the valley where a single stone had felled a giant, the caves where he had hidden from Saul's relentless pursuit, the throne rooms filled with both honor and betrayal, and the fields where the ark of God was brought home amid shouts of joy. Through it all, one truth had sustained him: the Lord had been his shepherd, and he had lacked nothing. As his words flowed, a profound peace filled the room. David did not shy away from the shadows of his past, the grievous mistakes, the betrayals, the bitter tears shed in repentance. He spoke of the God who had lifted him from the miry pit, who had heard his cries and set his feet upon a rock. "Great are the mercies of the Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling. "For he does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. As a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has had compassion on me." Turning his gaze to Solomon, David's expression softened with fatherly love. He offered no political strategy, no council of armies and alliances, but instead, a single unshakable foundation. "Know the God of your father, and serve him with a whole heart and a willing mind. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Be strong and courageous, and do the work the Lord has set before you." These were the words of a man who had learned, through every rise and fall, that true kingship begins and ends with a heart surrendered to God. Outside, the first light of dawn painted the horizon, and David's thoughts turned heavenward. He marveled at the faithfulness of the Lord, who had lifted him from shepherd's fields to Israel's throne, and who now was preparing to lead him into an everlasting kingdom. His heart swelled with gratitude, and from his lips came a final song, a quiet psalm of trust. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." In that moment, it seemed as if heaven itself leaned close to listen. The burdens of crown and kingdom slipped away, leaving only the soul of a man who had walked, stumbled, wept, rejoiced, and ultimately rested in the steadfast love of his God. And so David's life came to its gentle close, not with the clamor of armies or the fanfare of courts, but with the deep and abiding peace of one who had spent his days in the care of the eternal shepherd. His last words lingered like the fading strains of a harp, a testimony etched into the heart of Israel, that the Lord is faithful, that his mercy endures forever, and that those who walk in his ways will shine like the morning light, even when their earthly days draw to an end. In the stillness that follows the recounting of David's life, we turn to the songs that rose from his heart, melodies born in pastures under starlit skies, in the echoing caves of the wilderness, on battlefields soaked with the weight of victory and loss, and in the quiet chambers of repentance. These psalms are more than words on a page. They are the breathings of a soul that walked closely with God, through shadows and sunlight alike. Hear, then, the voice of David as he once lifted it, soft yet unshaken. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." These words, whispered in the dark, are the quiet heartbeat of David's life, a life that began among sheep, where he first learned to trust the shepherd who would never leave him. From the heights of joy, David sang, "I will extol you, O Lord, for you have drawn me up, and have not let my foes rejoice over me. O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have loosed my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, that my glory may sing your praise and not be silent. O Lord my God, I will give thanks to you forever." And in the depths of contrition, his voice trembled with a different melody, the psalm of a man who knew both the ache of sin and the unfathomable mercy of God. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love. According to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from your presence, and take not your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me with a willing spirit." Through every victory and every failure, David's songs circled back to the unchanging truth that God is faithful, his mercies are new every morning, and his kingdom endures forever. Even in his darkest nights, David's hope never waned. "I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand." As we let these ancient songs wash over us, may they bring a deep and quiet peace to our hearts. For the same God who walked with David in his days of triumph and in his nights of sorrow walks with us still. His rod and his staff guide us, his mercy surrounds us, and his promises hold us fast. Rest, then, in the assurance that the shepherd of David is your shepherd too. Let the melodies of these psalms settle in your spirit like dew upon the morning grass, whispering of his unfailing love and the eternal shelter found in his presence. The Psalms of David do not stand alone. Woven through them are the great themes of a life spent in pursuit of God's heart, trust that anchored him in every storm, repentance that drew him back when he strayed, thanksgiving that overflowed from lips familiar with both want and abundance, and a vision of God's kingship that outlasted every earthly throne. These threads, like golden strands of light, run through the tapestry of his psalms, binding his story to the eternal story of the one who reigns forever. Trust was the breath of David's faith, a steady rhythm that beat through his prayers and songs. Even in the wilderness, when enemies hunted him and shadows crowded close, his voice rose with quiet certainty. "When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me?" It was not that David was fearless, but that he knew where to rest his trembling heart. He had learned, in lonely pastures and in the courts of kings, that the Lord was his refuge and fortress, a stronghold that no enemy could breach. Even when his own strength faltered, when his plans unraveled, his trust was not misplaced, for it rested in the one who never sleeps, who guards his beloved with unshakable care. And when the path of trust wavered, when the weight of his own choices bent his soul low, David knew the language of repentance, words soaked with sorrow yet pulsing with hope. His psalms of confession are not cries of despair but of returning, like a child running home into open arms. "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against you, you only, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." In the quiet of the night, with the sting of failure heavy upon him, David discovered a truth that would echo through the ages, that God's mercy is deeper than any failure, his grace broader than any shame. Every tear shed in repentance became a seed watered by grace, giving birth to renewed joy. Gratitude, too, poured from David's life like a never-ending spring. Whether lifting songs of victory in the presence of gathered worshippers or whispering praise alone beneath the stars, thanksgiving was the natural language of his heart. He marveled at the steadfast love that had guided him from shepherd's fields to a throne he did not seek. I will bless the Lord at all times, his praise shall continually be in my mouth. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. In these words, gratitude is not a fleeting emotion but a posture, a way of seeing the world through the lens of God's unchanging faithfulness. Even in seasons of waiting and loss, David's heart learned to sing, for he had found in the Lord a joy not bound by circumstance. And overarching it all was David's vision of the eternal kingship of God. Though he himself wore a crown, he never mistook his reign for the true seat of power. Time and again, his psalms lift our gaze beyond earthly thrones to the sovereignty of the Lord. The Lord reigns, he is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed, he has put on strength as his belt. Yes, the world is established, it shall never be moved. Your throne is established from of old, you are from everlasting. David's life, with all its victories and failures, pointed to a greater reality, that the kingdom and the power and the glory belong not to man but to God alone. As we linger on these themes, a gentle invitation arises, to let the trust of David still our fears, to let his songs of repentance lead us into grace, to let his thanksgiving teach us to see the fingerprints of God in every part of our days, and to let his vision of the eternal King steady our hearts in the fleeting moments of this life. Perhaps, as we close our eyes, we might hear an echo of David's own prayer rising within us. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. In the quiet of this moment, may trust settle in your heart like a warm mantle, repentance wash over you like cleansing rain, gratitude flow through you like a gentle river, and the truth of God's eternal reign steady your spirit like the unshakable mountains. Rest now, knowing the same King who shepherded David still reigns over your life, guarding you in love that neither slumbers nor fades. And so the story draws to its quiet close, as all stories must, yet the echo of David's life lingers, like the fading notes of a harp still humming in the air long after the strings have stilled. He was called a man after God's own heart, not because he lived without flaw, nor because his path was free of stumbling, but because his heart, through triumph and failure, returned again and again to the one who had chosen him. In the twilight of his days, David looked back on a life of valleys and mountaintops, of psalms sung under starlit skies and battles fought in the light of day. He had known the sweetness of friendship and the sting of betrayal, the joy of victory and the bitter taste of loss. Through it all, the thread of God's faithfulness had remained unbroken, weaving even his missteps into the larger story of grace. As his reign gave way to the next generation and the torch of leadership passed to Solomon, David's legacy was not measured in wealth or monuments, but in a heart that sought the Lord. Even now, his words continue to rise like incense, songs of trust, repentance, thanksgiving, and hope, carrying across the centuries the reminder that the truest King of Israel was always the Lord himself. And so we remember David, shepherd and king, poet and warrior, a man whose longing for God shaped his every season. His life was a mirror, imperfect yet bright, reflecting the light of the eternal King who would one day come, the Son of David, in whom every promise finds its fulfillment. As the night deepens around us, may the faithfulness that held David hold you as well. May his psalms become your prayers, his trust become your rest, and his God become your shelter. Breathe deeply, let go of the day's burdens, and allow the steady truth of his presence to quiet your heart. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. And as you drift into sleep, may your spirit rest in the unchanging love of the one who shepherds your life, yesterday, today, and forevermore.